So as we just mentioned, Rashi believes that Kayin never repented, whereas Sadia Gaon and Ramban both think that Kayin did repent. The difference is that in Sadia Gaon's presentation, Kayin is like this model of tshuva. He did everything right for tshuva. He acknowledged how bad his sin was. He regretted it. He committed not to sin in the future. Whereas according to Ramban, he admitted that he had done a terrible sin and that God's punishment, God's sentence against him, the curse that he'll be a nomad, a wanderer, was fair. But Ramban, unlike Sadia, doesn't think that Kayin ever did some sort of a complete full tshuva with all the stages of tshuva. Now, in this video, as we continue here, I would like to sum things up and get the big picture of things. If you did your homework, so you read that wonderful shir from Gush VBM by Rav Ezra Bick, and what Rav Bick did is something I think some of you felt was lacking when we had done this in class. Rav Bick took a look at several of the things that we've been discussing throughout the semester, and he took a step back and tried to derive from them a big picture way of portraying Kayin's character. So we saw one possible way to do this is the way Rashi views Kayin as a villain, and that is something where Rashi offered consistent interpretations on pretty much every issue we brought up that portray Kayin as a villain. Here, I filled in Rashi's view in the interest of time. So Rashi consistently on each point argues that something that Kayin does is negative. So why does he become a farmer? Well, the land was cursed. Hevel knew not to become a farmer because Hevel knew that God had just cursed the land after Adam's sin, and yet Kayin decided to work the land even though the land was cursed. So that already gives us a bad impression of him. Next, we look at the quality of each person's korban. We know Hevel brought a good korban, mibechorot sono, the firstborns of his fruit, michal vehen. What did Kayin bring? We know it was fruit. Rashi says min hagarua. Garua means inferior, poor quality. What did God say to Kayin before the murder? Remember that sort of ambiguous pasuk over here? Halim tetiv se'et, halim lo tetiv lepatach hatat rovetz. We weren't sure how to translate it, but Rashi was pretty clear that God is basically warning Kayin about his desire to sin. He's warning him that it, meaning the Yetzer Hara, always has a teshukah. There's always this desire that you have with your Yetzer Hara to sin, but you need to try and rule over it. So according to Rashi, God is aware of the fact that Kayin is very tempted to sin there, fitting with how Kayin is. And then when Kayin finally approaches Hevel, and we saw there was this ambiguity in the pasuk that he said something to Hevel, Ve'yomer Kayin al Hevel achiv, but the Torah doesn't tell us what exactly he said. So Rashi explained the Torah doesn't have to tell us the exact words because the main point is that Kayin was seeking a fight. He was looking to create some sort of a riv, a fight, or a matzah, a quarrel, in order to sort of start something up with him, l'horgo, in order to kill him. So, again there, Rashi says, Kayin sought out an argument as a pretext to kill Hevel. Kayin wants this to escalate into a violent confrontation so he can kill Hevel. So in Rashi's perspective, Kayin all along is doing everything wrong, right? He goes into the profession working the land which was cursed. He brings the inferior korban. He then needs to be warned by God, don't give in to your Yetzer Hara, because obviously Kayin's Yetzer Hara is very powerful. He very much wants to sin, since he keeps doing these bad things. And so Kayin ignores that advice, and instead he goes looking for trouble. Right? He could have just stayed home if he knows he wants to hurt Hevel. No, he seeks Hevel out and tries to provoke a dispute with Hevel so that it'll turn violent, and then he has an excuse for killing Hevel. When God appears to Kayin and says, where is Hevel? Kayin says back, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? And he also says, lo yadati, I don't know where Hevel is. Again there, Rashi says, what's Kayin getting at? He's actually trying to trick God. Crazy as it sounds, he's trying to be gonev dara al-yana. He's trying to deceive God. And even after God then curses him, when Kayin speaks up one more time and says, Gadol avonim minesel, all the way down here, as we saw in the last video. Again, Rashi takes that phrase as something very negative, that kind of asking a question. He's not saying my sin is too great, which would mean acknowledging he did a terrible sin. Rather, he's saying, come on, can't God just forgive me? Is my sin really too great for God to forgive me? Come on, God, I'm sure you could, cut me some slack. And so Rashi presents this coherent picture of Kayin in every step of the way. He's a bad person at the beginning of the story, and he's a bad, maybe even an even worse person, because by now he's committed a murder, by the time we get to the end of the story. As we saw in the last video, even when that's done and Kayin finally leaves God and starts to wander the land, he is still a horrible person. He leaves b'hachna'ah, he leaves bowing in submission as if he's sorry, but it's all a scam. He's leaving b'hachna'ah kegonev da'at ha'elyona, like someone who's trying to deceive God. So Rashi, in sum, has a coherent, complete picture of Kayin as a villain from the beginning to the end of the story. We could add to this point that you could fundamentally agree with Rashi that Kayin is a villain and find other interpretations. You could disagree with certain of these interpretations, but interpret them in other ways that would still vilify Kayin. For example, Rashi says that Kayin chose a bad profession because he chose the land and the land was cursed. We discussed how there are others, such as Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So here we'll take Rashi's name off of this. There are others who give other reasons to vilify Kayin in terms of his choice of profession. Says Rav Hirsch, in general, most of our great heroes in Tanakh are shepherds. So, in general, Rav Hirsch argues shepherds are a more noble profession. We discussed in a separate video why that is. That they learn to deal with animals, which makes them compassionate, whereas farmers tend to be more greedy. And same thing on some of these other issues. In most of these other cases, we just stuck to Rashi. There could be other ways to explain some of these issues slightly differently than Rashi did, while still sticking to the main approach that Kayin is a villain. In other words, to find some other way, maybe instead of saying that Kayin sought out an argument as a pretext to kill Havel, there might be some other way to interpret their conversation that still makes Kayin look very bad. But the main thing I want to get at here is that on almost every point we found some source that offered some alternative to Rashi's explanation. And voila, this side of the chart is filled in. Now, pretty much each box here is quoting a different commentary. So this isn't one person's view, but collectively, you put all these different views together, you get a coherent picture that makes Kayin look very different. So, first of all, we pointed out it's not really a sin to be a farmer. In fact, the Torah gives us all kinds of mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, agricultural mitzvot, like Truma, Maaser, and Shemitah that have to do with farming the land, because it expects us to farm Eretz Yisrael. So obviously, the Torah doesn't think it's a terrible sin to farm the land. Maybe we need some extra mitzvot to guide us in how to do it properly as a spiritual person, but it's not a sin. As for the Korban, it never says in the Pasuk that it was Minagarua, it just says he brought fruit. So we saw there was that anonymous French rabbi that appeared in parentheses in Rashi, who says Me'ezer Shabar Liado was from whatever fruit Kayin had. Lo mutav lo muvchar, it's kind of not the best, but not the worst. And that still doesn't sound so great, not the best, not the worst. But it was also the first Korban ever, right? Whoever brought a Korban before that? What did God say to Kayin before the murder? So some Meforshim suggested that the focus wasn't so much on preventing Kayin from sinning. God isn't already assuming Kayin's going to sin, but trying to give him some sort of encouragement that he'll always be the older brother to Hevel. And so God isn't yet vilifying him. He's saying, look, right now you didn't do anything so wrong. You're a little disappointed that I preferred Hevel's offering, but that's not such a big deal, because at the end of the day, you're always going to be the leader. And so it's taking that phrase, to mean that the O in the bow is him, Hevel, that Hevel's desire will always be to you. You'll always rule over Hevel, meaning you'll always be the leader in the family. We pointed out this view interprets the word se'et to mean to be elevated like a firstborn, like the phrase that appears with Reuven, Yeter Se'et V'Yeter Az. What about when Kayin said something to Hevel before the murder? So we saw there were various interpretations that implied Kayin sought to have a conversation. Either he conveyed to Hevel what God had just told him, or we saw those opinions in the Midrash. They struck up a conversation about how they're going to divide the world and who's going to get the land, who's going to get the movable objects, or who's going to get the area where the Beit HaMikdash is built, or they were arguing over who to marry. Whatever it was a conversation that would have been a conversation between the two of them. If it escalated from a decent, peaceful, civil conversation into a fight, Hevel had something to do with that, and so it wasn't just Kayin's fault. Now, I left out here killing Hevel. Everyone agrees killing Hevel's bad. That you don't need to be, Rashi and follow the vilified approach to take. But after God confronts him and says, "Where's Hevel?" Some of these views say, when he says, "I don't know where Hevel is, am I my brother's keeper?" Certain people suggested, each in their own way, such as the Netziv or that Midrash that we read, that Kayin said, "Look, I know that you know I killed him. That's not what I mean when I say I don't know where Hevel is. I really mean, it's not my responsibility because you gave me Tzahara and you provoked me. Or it's not my responsibility because I thought you meant that I could rule over Hevel as the older brother, so much so that it'd be kind of like a king having a slave and I could do whatever I want to him." So one way or another, we also mentioned, although we didn't see it inside any Meforshim, maybe he even meant I don't know where Hevel is. I didn't know how death worked. I didn't know that his soul could leave his body. One way or another, there are various ways to read that pasuk where he's admitting to having killed Hevel, but he's somehow making excuses for why he did it. And lastly, when Kayin says Gadol Avoni means so, maybe he meant over here that I confess, or it's easier to read, that I'm confessing to a major sin. In other words, I admit that my sin is great. He's still saying, I hope you'll give me some forgiveness, I hope you'll protect me from death. But we saw in that Ramban, and even more so in Sadegam, even according to Ramban, he's confessing for his sin. So for homework, I had to read that essay by Rav Ezra Bick. What Rav Bick tries to do, he doesn't quote all the exact same sources that we did. In certain parts, he just quotes the psukim. But what he's trying to do is to be that guy, right? We never had that one guy as an alternative to Rashi who gives a wholly different, entirely different reading of Kayin with all these issues. So Rav Bick presents an essay that tries to do all of that in one essay. So in one essay, he paints this picture of Kayin as someone who starts out really great. I think Rav Bick plays up the fact that Kayin brought the first korban ever, and so he has every reason to feel good about himself. And then God kind of throws him for a loop when God doesn't accept that korban, and Kayin's not sure how to handle it, because he is very competitive vis-a-vis Havel. He's kind of jealous now. And Rav Bick argues very much that Kayin sought to have a conversation. Again, he doesn't take sides in the question of the different views in the Midrash as to what Kayin wanted to discuss, but he assumes Kayin wanted to have some sort of a conversation with Havel. But the conversation got out of hand, and Kayin already was feeling kind of bitter and jealous. And one thing led to another, and what began as a conversation became a fistfight, which became a murder. And after the fact, the thing that Kayin really struggles with is the issue of taking responsibility for his actions. That he, saying it's not my responsibility, it's not my fault. And from all this, Rav Bick developed a very interesting philosophical approach. Where Rav Bick noted that there are those whose starting point is that human beings are naturally, innately moral, and then all these structures of our society kind of mess that up. And Rav Bick argued that over here with Kayin and Hevel, you see something different. I mean, Kayin, they're only the second generation in the world, and already Kayin can be drawn to some sort of these negative feelings of jealousy and so forth that escalate to violence. And so the Torah seems to be saying that, in fact, man, from his very beginning, has these temptations that he struggles with, these challenges he struggles with, these negative emotions like jealousy and competition. And in some ways, those things can be harder to overcome than what Adam struggled with in chapter 1. And so Rav Bick very much sort of takes this approach that the Torah is kind of telling us here that we're going to need a whole Torah to come after this to help control man, regulate man, and guide man how to overcome these negative behaviors that Kayin is drawn to, but not because Kayin is some evil cartoon villain. Kayin could have been just like all of us, but he's this tragic figure, and that he lets these negative traits